They chained her in the middle of town and called it justice. But the first ones to step forward weren't men with badges or guns. They were two little girls who had lost their mother and didn't yet know how to hate. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this travel farther than dust on a dry wind. And if you believe that sometimes the smallest voices carry the heaviest truth, stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it changed everything. The sun sat high over Red Hollow, pressing heat into the wooden boards and the backs of every man standing in that square, boots planted, arms folded, eyes fixed on the woman at the center like she was something that needed to be decided, not understood. Her wrists were bound in iron. The chain looped once around the post like someone wanted to make sure she stayed exactly where they put her, not a step closer, not a step free, and still she stood straight, chin level, dark, eyes steady, not begging, not speaking, just breathing slow like she had already accepted something the rest of them were too afraid to name. A few feet back, Sheriff Halvorsen wiped sweat from under his hat, glancing at the crowd more than the woman, because even he knew this wasn't about law anymore. It was about fear dressed up in something cleaner. Someone muttered under their breath. Someone else spat into the dust. And the town settled into that quiet that comes before a decision nobody wants to own. Then the sound came, soft at first, like small boots on dry dirt, out of place in a moment like this. Lily Cole was 10 years old and too thin for her age, with sun-faded hair and eyes that had learned to look for something that wasn't there anymore. And beside her, little Grace held onto her sleeve like the world might pull her away if she let go. They had slipped out from behind the general store where they'd been told to wait, told to stay out of sight, told that this was no place for children. But children don't understand lines drawn by fear. Not yet. They saw the woman the same way they saw a stray horse with ribs showing, or a bird with a broken wing. Not as a threat, but as something alone. Lily took one more step, then another, ignoring the sharp hiss of a shopkeeper calling her back, ignoring the weight of every adult eye turning toward her like she had just crossed something invisible. Grace followed because she always did, small fingers tightening, her gaze never leaving the woman at the post. Up on the edge of the square, Ethan Cole saw them move and felt something in his chest pull tight like a rope drawn too fast. He had been standing there since morning, hat low, saying nothing, doing what a man does when the world gets complicated. He watched, he waited, he kept his distance. But this wasn't distance anymore. Girls, he said, not loud, just enough for them to hear. But Lily didn't stop, and that was new, because Lily always listened. She reached into the pocket of her worn dress and pulled out a small piece of bread, wrapped in cloth, the last of what they had saved from breakfast, and she held it out with a hand that trembled just enough to show she wasn't as brave as she looked. The woman's eyes shifted then, not toward the crowd, not toward the sheriff, but down to that small offering, like it weighed more than the iron around her wrists. For a second, nothing moved, not the wind, not the men, not even the horses tied along the rail. It was as if the whole town had forgotten how to breathe. Grace stepped closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You look cold," she said, though the heat said otherwise, because children don't speak in facts, they speak in feeling. The woman didn't take the bread right away. Her hands remained still, bound as they were. But her eyes, they changed, just a fraction, like something long buried had been touched without permission. Behind them, a man scoffed. Another shook his head. Someone said the word savages, like it explained everything. But none of that reached the girls, because they weren't listening to the town, they were listening to something quieter. Ethan took a step forward now, boots crunching in the dust, his shadow stretching long between his daughters and the woman. And for a moment, he saw what Lily saw, not the chain, not the label, but the stillness, the strength, the way she held herself like she refused to be less than what she was, even here, even now. "Come back," he said again, softer this time, almost like a question, but Lily shook her head without turning. And when she spoke, her voice didn't belong to a child anymore. It carried something older, something certain. "She looks like Mama when she's sad." And just like that, the space between past and present closed so tight Ethan felt it in his throat. The crowd shifted. Uneasy, because words like that don't fit into a simple story. They don't stay in their place. They move. They change things. The sheriff cleared his throat, about to speak, to restore order, to remind everyone of what they were supposed to believe. But the words didn't come, because now everyone was looking at the same thing. Not a prisoner, not a problem, but a moment they couldn't undo. The woman finally moved her hands, slow, careful, as far as the chain allowed, and when her fingers brushed the cloth-wrapped bread, it wasn't like taking food. It was like accepting something far more dangerous, something that could not be locked away or judged from a distance. And somewhere in that silence, under the weight of 100 watching eyes, something shifted in Red Hollow. Not loud, not sudden, but certain, like the first crack in dry earth before rain. The bread stayed in her hands longer than anyone expected, not eaten, not refused, just held like it carried a meaning heavier than hunger, and the chain at her wrists gave a quiet pull when she shifted. The sound small, but sharp enough to remind everyone what she was supposed to be. Lily did not step back, even when the murmurs started again, even when a man near the well muttered that the girls should be taken home, even when the sheriff finally found his voice and cleared his throat like he could sweep the moment away with authority alone. Ethan moved closer now, each step measured, boots pressing into the same dust that had not changed in years, yet somehow felt different underfoot, like the ground itself had noticed something the men had not. Grace let go of her sister's sleeve and reached out, not to the chain, not to the iron, but to the woman's hand, stopping just short, her fingers hovering in that uncertain space where fear usually lives, but hers did not shake anymore. The woman looked down at that small hand, then at the bread again, and something in her posture softened, not weakness, not surrender, but recognition, the kind that does not need words to explain itself. The sheriff stepped forward, one hand resting near his belt, not threatening, just reminding. "That is far enough," he said, though his voice did not carry the weight it used to, not with the whole town watching something he could not control. Lily turned her head just enough to glance back at her father, not asking permission, just checking if he was still there, and Ethan gave the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when he knows there is no going back to the way things were before. A breeze moved through the square then, lifting dust in a slow spiral, brushing against hats and coats and the edges of that moment, and for a second, it felt like the whole town held its breath again. The woman finally spoke, her voice low, careful, each word placed like it mattered. "Why?" she asked, not to the sheriff, not to the men, but to the girls, and the question hung there, simple and impossible at the same time. Grace answered first, because she always did when things felt too big for silence. "Because you are alone," she said, as if that explained everything. And maybe it did. A few people shifted where they stood, boots scraping, glances exchanged, because loneliness was something they understood, even if they would not admit it out loud. Ethan felt the words settle into him like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward, touching places he had kept closed since his wife had been laid to rest on a hill just outside town, marked by nothing more than a wooden cross and a name carved by his own hands. He looked at the woman again, really looked this time, past the dust, past the chain, past what he had been told to see, and for a moment, he saw something familiar in the way she held herself, not broken, not pleading, just standing, enduring, the way his wife used to stand when the world pressed too hard. The sheriff spoke again, louder now, trying to gather what little authority remained. "This is not a place for children," he said, but the words felt late, like they had missed their chance to matter. Lily took a small step closer, close enough now that the edge of her dress brushed against the woman's skirt, and she gently pushed the bread forward again, more certain this time. "You can have it," she said, and the woman's fingers finally closed around it, slow, deliberate, like accepting a gift that could not be returned. The chain gave another soft sound as she moved, and this time, it did not feel like a warning. It felt like a question, one that no one in the square seemed ready to answer. Ethan stopped a few feet behind his daughters, close enough to reach them if he had to, far enough to let them stand on their own, and he realized that every eye in Red Hollow had shifted, not toward the sheriff, not toward the post, but toward him, waiting, measuring, wondering what kind of man he was going to be in a moment like this. He did not reach for a weapon, did not raise his voice, did not do anything the town would recognize as taking a stand, but he stayed where he was, And sometimes, that is how it begins, not with a shout, not with a fight, but with a man refusing to step back. The woman looked up then, meeting his eyes for the first time, and there was no accusation there, no fear, just a quiet awareness. Like she understood the weight of what stood between them, not just the distance, not just the people, but everything that had been built over years of mistrust and silence. Grace finally closed the small gap and rested her fingers lightly against the woman's hand, and nothing terrible happened. No sudden movement, no cry, just that simple contact, warm and human, in the middle of a place that had almost forgotten what that felt like. Somewhere behind them, a door creaked, a horse shifted, the ordinary sounds of the town creeping back and around the edges. But they did not break the moment. They only made it clearer, like the world continuing while something important unfolded right in the open. The sheriff looked from the girls to Ethan, waiting for him. To correct this, to pull them back, to restore the lines everyone understood, but Ethan did not move. And in that stillness, the question that had been circling the square since morning finally settled where it belonged. Not on the woman, not on the chain, but on the people watching, asking them, one by one, what they were willing to see and what they were willing to ignore. The touch did not break, and that was the part no one in Red Hollow knew how to explain, because everything they believed said it should have. That the moment Grace's small fingers met the woman's hand, something would go wrong. Something would prove them right, but nothing did, and the longer nothing happened, the heavier it became. The woman looked down at their hands, at the difference in size, in skin, in story, and her breath slowed in a way that spoke of control learned over years, not in. What stood in front of him felt like it had already become his concern, whether he wanted it or not. Ethan stepped closer, closing the last few feet until he stood just behind Lily and Grace. And from there he could see the marks on the woman's wrists where the iron had rested too long. Not fresh, not new, just there, like a history that had been carried quietly. He did not reach out, did not touch the chain, but he noticed it, the way it pulled slightly when she moved, the way it defined the space she was allowed to exist in, and something about that felt wrong in a way he could not easily put into words. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice steady, not loud, not soft, just there. And the question seemed to ripple through the crowd because it was not the kind of question they had been asking all morning. The woman held his gaze for a moment longer, measuring something unseen, then answered, "Naeli," and the name settled into the square like a stone dropped into still water. Simple, clear, undeniable. Grace repeated it under her breath, testing the sound like it was something fragile. "Naeli," and smiled in that quiet way children do when they decide something belongs. Lily nodded once, as if that was enough to confirm what she already knew, then looked back at her father. "She should not stay here," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only certainty. Behind them, a man let out a short laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than admitting he did not understand what he was seeing, and another shook his head, muttering about lines that should not be crossed, about order, about things that had always been done a certain way. The sheriff stepped forward again, closer now, his shadow falling across the edge of the space the girls had created. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said, though it was not clear who he was speaking to anymore. Ethan, the girls, or himself. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes still on Naeli, on the way she stood, on the way she had not pulled her hand away from Grace. And in that silence, something inside him shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough. He reached up and removed his hat, running a hand through his hair before settling it back in place. A small gesture, but one that carried weight in a town where men did not move without reason. "She has a name," he said finally, and the words were simple, but they cut through the noise like something sharper, because they changed what stood in front of them from an idea into a person. The breeze moved again, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant wood smoke, and with it came the quiet realization that the day was not going to unfold the way anyone had expected. Naeli's fingers tightened slightly around the piece of bread, not in possession, but in acknowledgement, and when she spoke again, her voice held something new, not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. "Why do you stay?" she asked, and this time the question was not for the children. It was for Ethan. He looked at his daughters, at the way they stood without hesitation, without doubt, and then back at Nayeli, and for a moment, he did not answer, because the truth was still forming, still finding its shape in a place that had been quiet for too long. Somewhere in the crowd, someone shifted away, another turned their head, small movements that did not draw attention on their own, but together began to change the shape of the square, as if the certainty that had filled it that morning was slowly draining out, replaced by something less comfortable, less defined. Ethan took a breath, steady and slow, and when he spoke, it was not loud, not meant for the whole town, but it carried anyway, because they do, he said, nodding slightly toward Lily and Grace. And in that moment, the line between what was and what could be blurred just enough to make everyone watching wonder which side they were standing on. The words settled heavier than the heat, not loud, not defiant, just there, and somehow that made them harder to ignore, because a man choosing to stay is quieter than a man choosing to fight. But it changes more. The sheriff exhaled slowly, like he had been holding something back all morning, and stepped closer until he stood within 10 feet of Ethan, careful, measured, as if the space between them had become something fragile. "You do not understand what you are stepping into," he said, not harsh, not unkind, but certain in the way men get when they have lived too long by one version of the world. Ethan did not look at him right away, his eyes still on Nayeli, on the way she stood with that same quiet strength, on the way his daughters had not moved from her side. And he realized something simple and unsettling. They had already stepped into it, all of them, the moment Lily had walked forward with that piece of bread. Grace shifted her weight slightly, her hand still resting against Nayeli's, and looked up at Ethan with that open trust children carry without thinking. "She can come home with us," she said, not asking, just stating, like it was the next step in something already decided. A ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, just enough to remind everyone they were still there, still watching, still holding on to what they believed this town should be. One man, near the hitching post, crossed his arms tighter. Another shook his head slowly, like he had seen this kind of thing go wrong before, even if he could not name when. The sheriff glanced at them, then back at Ethan, weighing something. "This is not how things are done," he said. And there it was, the line drawn not in dust, but in habit, in years of decisions made without question. Ethan finally turned his head, meeting the sheriff's eyes, and there was no anger there, no challenge, just a steadiness that had not been there that morning. "Maybe that is the problem," he said, and the words were soft enough to miss if you were not listening. But everyone was. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound from somewhere beyond the buildings, a distant creak of wood, the low murmur of a place continuing on, unaware that something inside it was being asked to change. Nayeli's fingers loosened slightly around the bread, not dropping it, just holding it differently now, like it was no longer something foreign. And when she looked at Ethan again, there was a question there, not about him, but about what came next. Lily took a small step closer to her father, not leaving Nayeli, just closing the space between the three of them. And for the first time, they looked like something connected, something the town had not planned for. "She cannot stay here," Lily said again, quieter this time, but no less certain, and Grace nodded beside her, echoing the truth in a way only children can. The sheriff ran a hand along his jaw, eyes moving between the girls, the woman, and Ethan, searching for something he could hold on to, something that would let him keep the order he understood. "There are reasons," he began. But the sentence did not finish, because reasons sound different when they are spoken in front of a child who does not accept them. A woman near the edge of the crowd shifted her stance, her expression softening just a fraction, while another man looked away entirely, like it was easier not to see than to admit something did not fit anymore. Ethan took one more step forward, close enough now that the chain was within reach, close enough to hear the quiet rhythm of Nayeli's breathing, steady, controlled, like she had learned long ago that stillness could be its own kind of strength. He did not touch the iron, not yet, but he looked at it, really looked, at the way it circled the post, at the way it defined everything about how she was being seen, and something in him resisted that, not loudly, not in anger, but in a way that felt deeper, more certain. "If she has done something wrong," he said slowly, choosing each word like it mattered, "then say it." And the question moved through the square like a low wind, touching each person, asking them to answer. No one spoke right away, because for all the certainty that had filled the morning, there was no simple answer to give, no clear story to repeat. The sheriff's mouth opened, then closed again, and in that hesitation, something shifted, because silence can say more than any accusation. Grace looked up at Nayeli, then back at Ethan, her voice soft but steady. "She is not bad," she said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any argument, because it did not try to prove anything. It just existed. Nayeli's gaze moved between them, then settled on Ethan, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet weight as before. "You will stand," she said, not asking, not doubting, just stating what she saw. And for a moment, Ethan did not answer, because the truth of it was still settling into him. The crowd shifted again, smaller now, less certain, as if the edges of what they believed were starting to blur, and in that uncertainty, the center of the square changed shape, no longer a place of judgment, but a place of choice. Ethan reached out then, not to the chain, not to the post, but to the space between. What was expected and what felt right, his hand stopping just short, his eyes steady on Nayeli's. And in that suspended moment, before anything was done, before any line was truly crossed, the entire town seemed to lean forward, waiting to see whether he would step back into the world they knew, or move into something none of them were ready to name. His hand did not move forward, not yet, but it did not fall back either. And that was enough to change the air between them, because hesitation can look like doubt, but sometimes it is the moment a man decides who he is going to be. The chain hung there, quiet, unmoving, yet somehow louder than anything the crowd could say, and Ethan's eyes stayed on it, not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of steady attention that made it impossible to ignore what it represented. Lily shifted closer, her shoulder brushing lightly against his side, grounding him in a way only she could, while Grace kept her hand where it was, small fingers resting against Nayeli's, as if she had already made a promise no one else could hear. The sheriff took another step, slower this time, careful not to startle the fragile balance that had settled over the square. "Think this through," he said, his voice lower now, almost private despite the crowd. "Once you do this, there is no stepping back," and that was the truth of it, not spoken as a warning, but as a fact. Ethan nodded once, almost to himself, because he understood that better than anyone, understood what it meant to cross a line that could not be uncrossed, to choose something that would follow him long after the dust settled. Nayeli watched him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper. Now, searching, measuring, as if she had seen men stand at this edge before and knew how easily they could turn away. The breeze moved again, lifting the edge of her dark hair, carrying the faint scent of sun-warmed earth and something older, something that did not belong to the town, and for a moment, it felt like the world beyond Red Hollow was leaning in, waiting. A child laughed somewhere far off, a sound out of place in the tension, but real, reminding them that life continued even when choices stood still. Ethan drew a slow breath, the kind that settles deep, and when he let it out, his hand moved, not fast, not dramatic, just forward, closing the last inch of space until his fingers brushed the cold iron of the chain. The contact was simple, but it carried weight, because it was the first time anyone had touched it without purpose of holding it in place. The metal felt solid, unyielding, but not permanent, and that realization settled into him with quiet certainty. The sheriff saw it and stilled, not reaching, not stopping him, just watching, because there are moments when even authority knows it cannot interrupt without breaking something it does not understand. Lily looked up at her father then, her eyes wide but steady, not afraid, just present, and Ethan gave her the smallest nod again, a silent acknowledgement that what came next belonged to all of them. Nayeli did not move away, did not pull back, but there was a shift in her stance, a readiness, not for resistance, but for whatever truth this moment might bring. The crowd held its breath again, the kind of silence that presses in from all sides, where even the smallest sound feels like it might tip the balance. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on the chain, testing its weight, its give, not forcing, just understanding. And in that simple act, something changed, because he was no longer standing outside the moment, he was inside it. "You said she has done nothing wrong," he said quietly, not looking at the sheriff now, not looking at the crowd, but speaking into the space where truth had to land, and no one has said otherwise. And the words settled like dust after a long ride, slow, undeniable. No one answered, not because they could not, but because there was nothing clear enough to say, no story strong enough to hold against what was happening in front of them. Grace shifted her feet, her small boots leaving faint marks in the dirt, and looked up at Nayeli with a soft smile that did not ask for permission, only offered presence. And Nayeli's gaze softened again, just a fraction, enough to be seen if you were looking. Ethan exhaled once more, steady, and then his hand moved along the chain, following its line to where it wrapped around the post, his fingers tracing the path as if learning it, understanding it, and for the first time, the chain looked less like a boundary and more like something that could be undone. The sheriff took a half step forward, then stopped himself, his hand hovering at his side, because whatever was about to happen did not belong to him anymore. A man at the edge of the crowd turned away completely, unable to watch, while another leaned in, slightly, drawn by something he could not name. The sun shifted just enough to cast new shadows across the square, stretching long and thin, touching each person in a different way, and in that shifting light, the moment felt both smaller and larger at the same time. Ethan paused, his hand resting where the chain met itself, the point where it held, where it decided what was allowed and what was not. And he looked up at Nayeli one more time, not asking, not seeking approval, just acknowledging her presence in the choice he was about to make. She held his gaze without flinching, without expectation, and in that quiet exchange, something passed between them that the crowd could not see. Something built not on words, but on recognition. Lily took a breath she did not realize she had been holding, and Grace's fingers curled slightly, holding on just a bit tighter, as if she could feel the moment stretching towards something inevitable. And then, without hurry, without force, Ethan began to lift the chain, not breaking it, not tearing it away, but raising it just enough to see what lay beneath. Just enough to prove that what had been fixed in place all morning was not as unchangeable as it had seemed, and in that small, deliberate motion, the entire square leaned into a truth it had not been ready to face, that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is not hold something in place, but let it move. The chain rose just an inch, maybe two, but it was enough to change how it looked, no longer fixed, no longer final. And that small movement carried farther than any shout could have, because everyone in that square saw it, felt it, understood what it meant even if they could not say it out loud. Ethan did not rush, his hand steady as he held the weight, testing not the metal, but the moment itself, and in that stillness, the world seemed to narrow down to the space between his fingers and the iron. Nayeli did not pull away, did not step forward. She simply stood as she had from the beginning. But there was a shift in her breathing now, subtle, controlled, like someone who had learned to expect nothing and yet could not ignore what was happening. Grace looked up at the lifted chain, her eyes wide with something close to wonder, as if she had just discovered that the things adults called unchangeable might not be as solid as they seemed. And Lily's gaze moved between her father and Nayeli, steady, certain, as if she had known all along that this was where the path would lead. The sheriff took another step forward, slower now, careful not to break what he did not yet understand. "Ethan," he said, not as a command, not even as a warning, but as a name spoken into a moment that had already moved beyond him. And there was something in his voice that suggested he was no longer sure which side of it he stood on. Ethan did not answer right away, his attention still on the chain, on the way it had been placed there without question, on the way it had defined everything about this situation from the moment it was locked. And he realized something simple and undeniable. It had only ever been there because no one had chosen to move it. A man near the edge of the crowd shifted his stance, his boots grinding softly against the dirt, while another lowered his gaze entirely, unable to watch as something familiar began to slip. The breeze carried through again, softer now, brushing against sleeves and collars, lifting a strand of Nayeli's hair across her face before letting it fall, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, just briefly, as if feeling something she had not expected to feel in a place like this. Ethan followed the line of the chain with his hand, slowly, deliberately, until he reached the point where it looped around the post, and there he paused, Not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood the weight of doing it. Lily took a small breath, her fingers curling slightly at her sides, and Grace's hand tightened again around Nayeli's, not in fear, but in something like quiet reassurance, as if she were the one offering strength now. "If you do this," the sheriff said, softer than before, "you answer for it." And the words did not carry threat, only truth, because that was the way of places like Red Hollow. Choices did not disappear, they stayed. They shaped what came next. Ethan nodded. Once, barely noticeable, because he already knew that, had known at the moment his daughters stepped forward, and he had followed. Nayeli opened her eyes again and met his gaze, and in that look there was no demand, no expectation, just a calm awareness that whatever happened now would not be undone. The crowd seemed to lean in without moving, a quiet shift, a shared breath, as if the entire town had become a single witness to something it had not chosen but could not escape. Ethan's fingers found the point where the chain held against itself, where it had been secured, and he studied it for a moment, not as an obstacle, but as a decision someone else had made. And he understood then that what he was about to do was not about breaking anything. It was about choosing differently. He adjusted his grip, steady, careful, and began to ease the chain free from its hold, not with force, but with intention. Each small movement deliberate, each inch earned, and as the metal shifted, it made a soft sound, not loud, not harsh, just enough to be heard, enough to mark the change. Grace's eyes followed the motion, her expression open, unguarded, while Lily stood still, her certainty unwavering, as if she had already stepped beyond this moment and was waiting for the rest of them to catch up. The sheriff did not move again, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed on Ethan, because there are moments when even the law recognizes it is no longer the one deciding. Nayeli remained still as the tension in the chain began to loosen, her posture unchanged, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted, not relief, not yet, but the recognition that what had been fixed was beginning to give way. Ethan did not look at the crowd, did not look for approval or support. He kept his focus where it mattered, on the simple act in front of him, on the choice he was making, and in that focus, everything else seemed to fall away. The final loop slipped free with a quiet release, the chain no longer anchored to the post, no longer defining the space she could stand in, and Ethan held it there for a moment, the weight of it now entirely in his hands. No one spoke, no one stepped forward, because the meaning of that small action was too large to be interrupted, too clear to be denied. Grace let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her hand still resting against Nayeli's, while Lily's shoulders eased just slightly, as if something inside her had settled into place. Ethan lowered the chain slowly, carefully, not dropping it, not casting it aside, but letting it rest without the hold it once had, and in that simple, quiet motion, the entire square shifted, because what had been certain was no longer certain, and what had been fixed was now something else entirely, something that could move, something that could change, something that no one in Red Hollow had been ready to see until that very moment. The chain rested in Ethan's hands now, no longer holding anything in place, and the absence of its tension felt louder than its weight ever had, because the moment it stopped defining her, the entire square lost the certainty it had been leaning on. No one spoke, not the sheriff, not the men, not even the ones who had been so sure just minutes ago. Because there are moments when silence is the only thing strong enough to carry what has changed. Nayeli did not move right away, her wrists still marked by where the iron had been, her posture unchanged. But there was something different in the way she stood now, something unbound that had nothing to do with the chain itself. Grace slowly withdrew her hand, not pulling away, just easing back as if she trusted that the space between them would hold, and Lily stepped half a pace closer to her father, her eyes still fixed on Nayeli, watching not for danger, but for what would come next. Ethan lowered the chain carefully to the ground, letting it settle into the dust with a quiet sound that seemed to echo farther than it should have, because it marked the end of something no one had named out loud. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand brushing against his belt, not out of habit this time, but uncertainty. "This does not change what she is," he said, but the words did not carry the same conviction they once would have, because even as he spoke them, He was looking at her differently. Ethan straightened, his shoulders set, his gaze steady. "It changes how we see it," he replied, and the distinction hung there, subtle but undeniable, like the difference between night and the first hint of dawn. A murmur moved through the crowd, softer now, less certain, as if the ground beneath their shared belief had shifted just enough to make standing still feel uneasy. Nayeli lifted her hands slightly, studying her wrists, not with relief, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement, like someone who had expected nothing and found something else instead. She looked at Ethan again, her expression unreadable to most, but not empty, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm weight. "You have changed the story," she said, not as praise, not as judgment, just as truth. Lily exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing in a way that suggested she had been holding more than breath, and Grace looked between them with a small, certain smile, as if the world had just corrected itself, in a way only she had seen coming. One of the men near the edge of the square cleared his throat, glancing around as if expecting someone else to step forward and restore what had been, but no one did, because no one knew how to put it back. The sheriff looked at Ethan, then at the chain on the ground, then at Nayeli, and for a moment, it seemed like he might speak again, might try to gather what was left of the order he understood, but the words did not come, because the moment had already moved beyond him. The breeze carried through once more, lifting dust in soft patterns that drifted between boots and boards, and in that quiet movement, the town seemed to settle into something new, something not yet defined. Ethan glanced at his daughters, at the way they stood without fear, without hesitation, and something in his chest steadied, not because the path ahead was clear, but because he was no longer walking it alone. "We are leaving," he said finally, not loud, not forceful, just certain, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have. The sheriff's eyes followed him, searching for something to stop him, but finding none that would hold, and so he said nothing. Because sometimes silence is the only answer left. Nayeli hesitated for a fraction of a second, not in doubt, but in recognition of the line she was crossing, not just in space, but in everything that had defined her place in that town until now. Then she stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step, the dust shifting beneath her feet in a way that felt almost ceremonial, like the ground itself marking the change. No one moved to stop her, no one reached out, because the moment had already decided itself. Grace walked beside her without thinking, her small hand brushing against Nayeli's again, not to guide, not to lead, just to be there, and Lily stayed close to her father, her presence steady, anchoring him in the choice he had made. The crowd parted without being asked, a subtle shifting of bodies, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed in a way they could not yet undo. Ethan did not look back as he turned toward the road that led out of the square, his steps measured, his posture calm, as if this had always been the direction he was meant to take, even if he had only just realized it. Behind him, the chain lay in the dust, no longer holding anything, no longer defining anyone, just a piece of metal that had lost its meaning the moment someone chose to see differently. And in the space it left behind, Red Hollow stood quieter than it had in years, not because nothing had happened, but because something had, something small, something silent, something that would not be forgotten, even by those who wished it could be. The road out of the square stretched ahead in a thin line of dust and sunlight, familiar and unchanged. Yet every step they took along it felt different, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath them without anyone noticing until now. Ethan walked in silence, his boots steady, his pace neither rushed nor slow, but deliberate, like a man who had made a choice and was still learning the weight of it with each step. Lily stayed close at his side, her eyes forward, her expression calm in a way that did not belong to her age, while Grace walked just beside Nayeli, her small presence bridging a space that no one in Red Hollow would have crossed an hour ago. Nayeli moved with quiet control, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady on the road ahead, but there was something in the way her hands rested now, unbound, free of the iron that had defined her only moments before, something that carried both caution and awareness, like a door opened just enough to see through, but not yet wide enough to step fully across. Behind them, the town remained where it had always been, Wooden buildings, sun-bleached signs, the faint murmur of voices that had not yet found new words for what they had witnessed, and though no one followed, the weight of their watching lingered like a shadow that stretched farther than the square. A gust of wind moved through the open space between buildings, carrying the dry scent of hay and distant cattle, and with it came the sound of something loose tapping against wood, a quiet reminder that the world did not stop for moments like this, even when they felt large enough to reshape it. Ethan glanced once over his shoulder, not to see if they were being followed, but to measure the distance, to understand how far they had already come, and when he turned back, there was no hesitation left in his step, only the steady rhythm of a man walking forward. "How far is your place?" Nayeli asked after a time, her voice low, careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for the silence that had settled between them, and Ethan answered without looking at her. "About half a mile." His tone even, grounded, as if distance was something simple compared to everything else that had shifted. Grace looked up at Nayeli, her expression open. "Curious. Do you like horses?" she asked, because to her, that was what mattered. Not where someone came from, not what they had been called, but whether they could share something familiar, something small. Nayeli's gaze softened just slightly, and she nodded once. "Yes," she said, and that single word seemed to ease something in Grace that had never been tight to begin with. Lily walked a few steps ahead, then slowed, glancing back at her father, her voice quiet but certain. "Are people going to be angry?" she asked. "Not afraid, just aware," and Ethan considered the question for a moment before answering. "Some will," he said, honest, because he had learned long ago that children understand truth better than comfort. "But that does not change what we did." Lily nodded once, accepting it without question, because for her, the choice had already been made long before anyone else had caught up. The land around them opened wider as they moved away from the town, the buildings giving way to dry grass and scattered fence posts, the horizon stretching out in a way that made everything feel both smaller and more possible at the same time. Nayeli slowed her pace slightly, her eyes scanning the land with a familiarity that did not come from ownership, but from understanding, as if she read the ground the way others read words, noticing things that did not need to be spoken. Ethan noticed it too, not as something foreign, but as something different, and for the first time, he wondered not who she had been to the town, but who she was beyond it. "You said no one spoke," he said after a moment, his voice measured, "about what you had done." And the question hung there, not demanding, not accusing, just open. Nayeli did not answer right away, her gaze still on the horizon, her steps steady, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same quiet weight. "They did not ask," she said, and the simplicity of it settled into the space between them like a truth too clear to argue with. Ethan let the words sit, turning them over in his mind, not searching for something to challenge, but for something to understand, and in that quiet reflection, he felt the edges of what he had believed begin to shift again, not breaking, but bending. The fence line came into view ahead, weathered wood stretching across the land in a long, uneven line, marking the boundary of something that had always been his, something he understood, something that had never asked him to question it before. Grace pointed toward it with a small smile. "That is our home," she said, pride in her voice, simple and clear, and Nayeli followed her gesture, her eyes tracing the line, taking in the structure, the space, the distance from the town they had left behind. Ethan slowed as they reached the gate, his hand resting briefly on the worn wood, the familiar texture grounding him in a way the square never could. And for a moment, he paused, not because he doubted, but because he understood that crossing this line carried its own meaning. Lily stepped through first without hesitation, her movement easy, natural, as if she had always known that this place could hold more than it had before, and Grace followed, turning back to make sure Nayeli came with her, her small hand lifting slightly in an unspoken invitation. Nayeli stood at the threshold for a fraction of a second, her gaze moving from the open land behind her to the quiet space ahead, and then she stepped forward, not quickly, not reluctantly, but with a calm acceptance that did not need to announce itself. Ethan watched her cross, his expression unreadable to anyone but himself, and then he followed, closing the distance with a single step, leaving the road behind without looking back. The gate remained open, the wind moving gently through it, carrying the faint sounds of the land. And somewhere in that quiet, the weight of what had happened in the square began to settle into something else. Not finished, not resolved, but moving, like the path ahead stretching out under a sky that had not changed, even as everything beneath it had. The yard felt different the moment they stepped into it. Not because anything had changed, the same worn boards of the house, the same quiet barn off to the side, the same stretch of dry grass moving under the afternoon wind, but because something new had entered it, something the place had never held before. Ethan closed the gate behind them with a soft push, the wood settling into place with a familiar sound that grounded him. Yet even that sound carried a different weight now, like it marked not just the boundary of his land, but the beginning of something he did not yet fully understand. Lily moved toward the porch without hesitation, her steps light, her eyes already scanning the space as if measuring where things would fit, while Grace stayed close to Nayeli, looking up at her with quiet curiosity, not asking questions, just being present in a way that made the silence feel less heavy. Nayeli stood for a moment in the center of the yard, her gaze moving slowly across the land, taking in the house, the barn, the fence line stretching out toward the horizon, and there was something in the way she looked that spoke of awareness, not ownership, but understanding, as if she could read the story of the place without needing it explained. Ethan watched her from a few steps away, his posture steady, his expression calm, but inside there was a shift, a quiet recognition that what had happened in the town had followed them here, not as a burden, but as something unfinished. "It is quiet," Nayeli said after a moment, her voice low, not as an observation, but as a statement of something she felt, and Ethan nodded once. "It usually is," he replied, though the words carried a subtle change, as if even he was realizing that quiet meant something different now. Grace smiled at that, her small hands clasping together as she looked toward the barn. "We have 2 horses," she said, her voice bright, offering something simple, something safe, and Nayeli's gaze followed her, expression softening just slightly, enough to show that she understood the gesture for what it was. Lily reached the porch and paused, turning back to look at them, her eyes moving between her father and Nayeli, and there was a question there, not spoken, but clear, about what came next, about how this new shape of their world would settle. Ethan stepped forward then, closing the distance, his boots pressing into the familiar dirt, and he stopped a few feet from Nayeli, not too close, not too far, respecting a space that did not need to be defined by anything but awareness. "You can rest here," he said, his tone even, offering without forcing, and Nayeli met his gaze, her expression steady, as if weighing not the words, but the intention behind them. "I will stay," she said simply, and the words carried no hesitation, no doubt, just a quiet acceptance that felt larger than the sentence itself. The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the faint sound of something loose tapping against the side of the barn, a rhythm that had been there before, unnoticed, now clearer in the stillness. Grace took a step toward the house, then stopped, turning back, her small voice soft but certain. "We have water inside," she said, and Nayeli inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the offer without moving just yet. Ethan glanced toward the house, then back at Nayeli, and for a moment, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding that the next step mattered in a different way, that it was not just about space, but about trust. Lily stepped down from the porch, her movements calm, and walked back toward them, stopping beside her father, her presence steady, grounding, and she looked up at him with that same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning, as if to remind him that they were already past the point of turning back. Nayeli shifted her weight slightly, her gaze moving once more across the land, then settling on the house. And there was a moment, brief but clear, where something in her posture eased, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that the space was beginning to change around her. Ethan noticed it, not as something to comment on, but as something to respect, and he stepped aside just enough to open the path toward the porch, not leading, not directing, just allowing. Grace smiled again, her small hand lifting in that same unspoken invitation, and this time, Nayeli stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate, her steps measured as she crossed the yard, the distance not long, but carrying more weight than miles. Lily walked beside her now, not touching, not guiding, just present, and Ethan followed a step behind, his eyes steady, his thoughts quiet, letting the moment unfold without trying to shape it. The porch boards creaked softly under their weight as they reached it, the sound familiar, grounding, and Nayeli paused again at the threshold, her gaze moving from the worn wood beneath her feet to the open doorway ahead. And for a moment, the silence returned, not heavy, not tense, just present, like a breath held before something new. Inside, the house waited as it always had, simple, quiet, unchanged. Yet in that moment, it felt different, not because of what it was, but because of who was about to enter it. Ethan stood just behind her, close enough to be there, far enough to let the choice remain hers, and Lily and Grace waited too, their stillness speaking louder than any words could. Nayeli lifted her foot and stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the house. And with that single, quiet motion, something shifted again, not in the land, not in the walls, but in the space between them, something unseen, something unspoken, something that would not be undone, even as the sun continued its slow descent over the open sky beyond. The air inside the house felt cooler, not because the sun had changed, but because the walls held a different kind of silence, one that had been shaped by years of routine, of quiet mornings and long evenings, of voices that had grown softer after loss. And now that silence shifted, not broken, just stretched to make room for something new. Nayeli stood just inside the doorway, her eyes adjusting not to the light, but to the space itself. The worn table near the window, the chair slightly angled as if someone had risen from it not long ago, the small details that spoke of a life lived carefully, deliberately. Without excess, Grace moved past her with an easy familiarity, stepping toward the wooden pitcher on the table, her small hands wrapping around it as she poured water into a tin cup, the sound of it simple and steady. And when she turned back, she held it out without hesitation, her expression open, offering not as a gesture of kindness, but as something natural, something expected. Nayeli accepted the cup this time without pause, her fingers steady as they closed around the cool metal, and she drank slowly, not out of thirst alone, but as if acknowledging the space she had entered, the quiet agreement that came with it. Lily stepped inside next, her gaze moving across the room in a way that suggested she was seeing it differently now, not as it had always been, but as it might become, and she moved to the window, pushing it open just enough to let the breeze slip through, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and distant earth. Ethan remained near the doorway for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against the frame, as if marking the boundary between what had been outside and what now stood within. And when he finally stepped in, he did so without hesitation, closing the door behind him with a soft, measured motion that seemed to settle something in the room. The sound of the latch falling into place was quiet, but it carried weight, not as a barrier, but as a decision, one that did not need to be spoken aloud. Nayeli lowered the cup slightly, her gaze moving from the table to the walls, to the small objects that filled the space, a folded cloth, a pair of boots set neatly near the door, the kind of details that reveal more about a life than words ever could. "You keep things in order," she said, her voice calm, not as praise, but as observation, and Ethan gave a small nod. "It helps," he replied, though the words felt different now, as if order meant something more than it had before. Grace set the pitcher back down with care, then moved closer to Nayeli, her curiosity gentle, unforced. "Do you want to sit?" she asked, gesturing toward the chair, and Nayeli looked at it for a moment, not as an object, but as a place, a space offered. And after a brief pause, she nodded and stepped forward, lowering herself into the chair with a quiet grace that did not disturb the stillness of the room. Lily watched her, her expression thoughtful, as if she were trying to understand something beyond what could be seen, and she moved to sit across from her, not too close, not too far, creating a balance that felt instinctive rather than planned. Ethan crossed the room slowly, his boots soft against the wooden floor, and he stopped near the table, his hands resting lightly on its edge, grounding himself in something familiar as he took in the sight before him. His daughters seated with Nayeli, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by presence. Outside, The wind continued its quiet movement, brushing against the walls, carrying with it the faint sound of the land, a reminder that the world beyond this room had not changed, even as everything within it had shifted. Nayeli held the cup in her hands, her fingers tracing its edge lightly, and for a moment, she seemed to listen, not to the room, not to the voices, but to something deeper, something that did not need to be spoken. "This place," she said after a while, her voice steady. "It remembers," and the words hung in the air, simple, yet layered with meaning, and Ethan felt them settle into him in a way he could not easily explain. He glanced at the chair near the corner, the one that had not been moved since his wife had last sat in it, the one that had remained untouched, not out of neglect, but out of respect, and for the first time, he saw it not as something that held the past, but as something that might still belong to the present. Lily followed his gaze, her eyes resting on the same chair, and there was a moment of quiet understanding between them, unspoken, but clear, as if they both recognized that the room was no longer what it had been. Grace shifted in her seat, her small voice breaking the silence gently. "We can make room," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a truth she had already accepted, and Nayeli looked at her, a faint softness touching her expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that carried warmth without needing to show it fully. Ethan drew a slow breath, his shoulders easing as he let it out, and in that moment, he understood that the space they stood in was no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what was being built, quietly, without force, without demand. He moved then, stepping toward the corner, his hand reaching out to the back of the untouched chair, and he paused there, his fingers resting lightly against the worn wood, as if asking permission from something unseen, and after a brief moment, he lifted it, not with effort, but with intention, and carried it toward the table, placing it beside the others with a quiet finality that spoke louder than any words could. The room shifted again, not in sound, not in light, but in meaning, and Nayeli watched him, her gaze steady, her understanding clear, as if she recognized the significance of what had just been done, not as a gesture, but as a step, small, deliberate, and impossible to undo. The chair settled beside the table with a soft, grounded sound, and for a moment no one moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because something had already been done that could not be taken back, and the room felt it in the quiet way walls remember footsteps long after they fade. Nayeli's gaze lingered on the chair, not as furniture, but as a place offered without words, and she did not rush to fill it, did not shift her seat. She simply acknowledged it with a stillness that carried respect, as if she understood that some gestures were not meant to be answered quickly. Ethan remained standing near the table, his hand resting briefly against the worn wood, feeling the familiar grain beneath his palm, and for the first time in a long while, it did not feel like something he was holding together alone. It felt like something that could hold more. Lily leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on her knees, her eyes thoughtful, watching Nayeli not with curiosity anymore, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if she had already accepted her place in this space without needing to name it. Grace swung her feet gently against the leg of the chair, a small, steady rhythm, and in that simple movement there was a sense of ease that had not been there that morning, like a child who no longer questions whether she belongs. The light shifted slowly through the window, stretching across the floor in long, warm lines, touching each of them in turn, and the dust in the air moved softly within it, visible now in a way it had not been before, as if the room itself was revealing something it had kept hidden. "You moved it," Nayeli said after a time, her voice low, steady, not asking, not doubting, simply marking the act, and Ethan nodded once. "It was time," he replied, and the words carried more than their meaning. They carried the weight of something that had been waiting without either of them fully knowing it. Nayeli's eyes held his for a moment longer, and in that quiet exchange there was no tension, no distance, only an understanding that did not need explanation, as if both of them recognized that what had been set in motion was larger than the room, larger than the town they had left behind. Lily shifted in her seat, her gaze moving between them, and then she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "We can eat together tonight." And it was not a question, not even a suggestion. It was a continuation of something already begun, something that felt as natural to her as breathing. Grace nodded quickly, her small hands coming together in a quiet clap. "I can help," she said, her excitement simple, unguarded, and Ethan watched them both, a faint trace of something easing in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to be felt. Nayeli looked down at the cup still in her hands, then back up at the room, and there was a moment where her posture shifted just slightly. Not a release, not yet, but a softening that suggested the space was beginning to settle around her in a different way. "I will help too," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a quiet intention, a willingness not just to be present, but to take part. Outside, the wind moved across the land, brushing against the walls, carrying the distant sound of a loose gate somewhere far off, a reminder that the world beyond this house continued in its steady rhythm, unchanged by what had happened here, and yet somehow connected to it all the same. Ethan moved toward the counter, his steps measured, his hands reaching for familiar things, a pot, a cloth, the small routines that had shaped his days for so long. But now each movement felt slightly different, as if the pattern had been altered in a way that made space for something new. Lily stood and joined him without being asked, her movements confident, practiced, while Grace lingered near Nayeli, her presence steady, offering without pressing. And after a moment, Nayeli rose from her chair, setting the cup gently on the table before stepping closer, her movements quiet, deliberate, as if she were learning the shape of the space with each step. The three of them moved together then, not perfectly, not seamlessly, but without friction, each finding a place, a role, without needing to be told, and Ethan watched it unfold with a quiet awareness that this simple act was where everything truly began, not in the square, not with the chain, but here, in the small, ordinary moments that build something lasting. The light continued to shift as the sun moved lower, the warmth of it softening, the shadows lengthening, and the room held it all, the quiet voices, the small movements, the unspoken understanding, and in that space, something took root, something that did not need to be named to be real. Nayeli paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, her gaze moving across the room. Once more, and then she looked at Ethan, not with question, not with doubt, but with a steady clarity. "This place," she said, her voice calm. "It will change," and Ethan met her gaze, his expression steady, his answer simple. "It already has." And in the silence that followed, the truth of it settled into the walls, into the floor, into the space between them, quiet, certain, and impossible to undo. The evening settled slowly over the land, not all at once, but in layers, the light softening, the air cooling, the long shadows stretching across the floor until they touched every corner of the room, and inside the house, the quiet work of preparing a meal continued, simple movements, steady hands, voices low and unforced, as if each of them understood that something delicate was being built and did not need to be rushed. Ethan stood at the stove, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been in years, his hands moving with practiced ease. But now there was an awareness in each motion, a recognition that the rhythm he had followed alone for so long had shifted, and he was no longer the only one shaping it. Lily worked beside him, passing what was needed without being asked, her focus steady, her presence grounded, while Grace moved between them and Nayeli, carrying small things, a cloth, a cup, a piece of bread, her movements light, her voice quiet but constant, filling the space with something that felt like continuity rather than interruption. Nayeli stood at the edge of the table, her hands moving with care, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if she were learning the language of the space through touch, through the weight of objects, through the way things were placed and used, and there was a calm in her that did not come from familiarity, but from a deeper understanding, the kind that adapts without needing to change its core. The sound of the wind outside softened as the night began to take hold, replaced by the faint calls of distant animals and the quiet creak of wood settling, and inside, the house held its own rhythm, steady, grounded, as if it had been waiting for this balance to return. The table was set without discussion, each place arranged with a quiet intention, not perfectly aligned, not carefully measured, but real, lived in. And when the last piece was placed, There was a brief pause, not awkward, not uncertain, just a moment where all four of them stood still, aware of what they had done without needing to name it. Ethan stepped back slightly, his gaze moving over the table, the chairs, the space they had created, and for a moment, his eyes rested on the empty places between them, the spaces that had once felt too large, too quiet, and now felt different, not filled, but held. "Sit," he said, his voice calm, not instructing, just offering, and Lily moved first, taking her place without hesitation, Grace following beside her, while Nayeli paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze moving once more across the room, as if acknowledging something unseen, and then she sat, her movement smooth, her posture steady, her presence fully within the space. Ethan took his seat last, not out of habit, but out of awareness, and as he settled into the chair, the one he had placed beside the others, there was a quiet shift in the room, something subtle but undeniable, as if the space had accepted what had been done. The meal itself was simple, nothing elaborate, nothing new, but the act of sharing it carried a weight that went beyond the food, beyond the routine, beyond anything that could be explained in words. Grace spoke softly between bites, her thoughts moving freely, her questions gentle, not probing, just curious, while Lily listened more than she spoke, her gaze thoughtful, her attention moving between her father and Nayeli, as if she were learning something she could not yet name. Nayeli ate slowly, not out of hesitation, but with a quiet presence that matched the rhythm of the room. And when she did speak, her words were few, but they carried a clarity that settled easily into the space, not disrupting it, but shaping it in small, meaningful ways. Ethan listened more than he spoke, his focus not on the food, not on the conversation, but on the way the room felt, on the way the silence between words no longer carried the same weight it once had. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to fill it. Outside, the last of the light faded, the sky deepening into a quiet darkness that stretched over the land, and the house stood within it, steady, grounded, holding the warmth of what had been created inside. When the meal ended, there was no rush to move, no need to clear the table immediately, just a shared stillness, a moment where each of them remained where they were, as if recognizing that this simple act of being together was something worth holding on to for just a little longer. Nayeli's gaze moved to the window, to the darkened land beyond, and then back to the room, to the table, to the people seated around it. And there was a shift in her expression, not a smile, not something easily seen, but a softening that spoke of something deeper, something that had begun to take root. "You did not ask," she said quietly, her voice steady, and Ethan looked at her, his expression calm. "You did not need to answer," he replied, and the words settled into the space between them, simple, but complete. Lily glanced between them, her eyes bright with a quiet understanding, while Grace leaned back in her chair, her small hands resting in her lap, content in a way that did not need explanation. The room held that moment, not stretching it, not rushing it, just allowing it to exist, and in that quiet, the truth of what had been built began to settle, not as something finished, not as something perfect, but as something real, something that would carry forward into whatever came next, shaped not by what had been decided in the town, but by what had been chosen here, in this place, in this moment, by people who had seen something different and decided to follow it, without needing to understand where it would lead. The night settled fully over the land, deep and quiet, stretching across the sky in a wide, endless dark that held every sound a little longer, every breath a little deeper, and inside the house, the last of the dishes had been cleared, not with haste, not with effort, but with a calm rhythm that felt earned, as if each small act carried the weight of something larger that did not need to be spoken. Ethan stood near the window, his hand resting lightly against the frame, looking out across the yard where the faint outline of the fence could still be seen against the dim horizon. And for the first time in a long while, the silence outside did not feel empty. It felt open, like a space waiting rather than something lost. Lily had already moved to the far side of the room, her posture relaxed, her eyes thoughtful as she folded a cloth with careful hands, while Grace sat on the floor nearby, her head leaning slightly against the leg of the chair, her eyes heavy with the kind of quiet Contentment that only comes when something inside settles into place. Nayeli stood near the table, her hands resting lightly against the wood, her gaze moving slowly across the room, not searching, not questioning, but taking in what was there. And in that quiet observation, there was a shift, subtle but clear, as if the space was no longer unfamiliar, no longer something to stand outside of, but something she had stepped into fully, without needing permission. The wind moved gently against the walls, a soft, steady sound that carried through the night, and somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted in the barn, the faint rustle of hay following, grounding the moment in something real, something unchanged. Ethan turned from the window then, his gaze moving to his daughters, to the way Grace had curled slightly where she sat, her breathing slow, even, and to Lily, who watched her with a quiet awareness that did not belong to her age. And then his eyes moved to Nayeli, and there was a pause, not uncertain, not hesitant, just present, as if he understood that this moment did not need to be filled with words. Nayeli met his gaze without turning away, her expression calm, steady, and for a brief moment, the distance between them, the one shaped by everything that had come before, seemed to settle into something else, something that did not disappear, but no longer stood in the way. "She will sleep," Nayeli said quietly, her voice soft enough not to disturb the stillness, and Ethan nodded once, stepping forward without hesitation, lifting Grace gently from where she sat, her small weight familiar in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder as if it had always belonged there. And he carried her toward the small room at the back, the door opening with a quiet creak before closing just as softly behind him. Lily watched him go, then turned back to Nayeli, her eyes steady, thoughtful, and she spoke without hesitation. "You can stay here," she said, not as a question, not as something to be decided, but as something already known. And Nayeli inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without needing to answer them directly. When Ethan returned, his steps slower, quieter, the room had shifted again, not in sound, not in shape, but in presence, and he paused for a moment near the doorway, taking it in, the table, the chairs, the two figures standing within it. And there was a stillness that settled into him, not heavy, not uncertain, but steady, like something that had finally found its place. Lily moved toward the small corner where a folded blanket rested, lifting it carefully, her movements deliberate, and she brought it toward Nayeli, holding it out with both hands, not offering comfort, not offering charity, but something simpler, something shared, and Nayeli accepted it with the same quiet care, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric, as if recognizing the meaning carried within the gesture. The room fell into silence again, not empty, not strained, but full in a way that did not need sound, and Ethan stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, and for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. Outside, the wind moved once more, softer now, the night deepening around the house, wrapping it in a quiet that felt protective rather than distant, and inside, the light from the small lamp cast a warm glow across the room, touching each face, each surface, holding them in a way that felt both gentle and certain. Nayeli looked toward the window, then back at the room, and finally at Ethan, her voice low, steady, carrying a quiet truth. "Tomorrow, they will come," she said, not as a warning, not as fear, but as something known, something inevitable, and Ethan met her gaze. Without hesitation, his answer just as calm. "Then we will be here." And the simplicity of it settled into the space between them, firm, unshaken. Lily stood beside them, her presence steady, her eyes clear, as if she understood more than either of them could say. And in that moment, the three of them stood not as separate parts, not as strangers brought together by chance, but as something else, something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to be named to be real. The lamp flickered slightly as the night deepened, the shadows shifting gently along the walls, and in that soft, steady light, the house held them, not as it had before, not as a place marked by absence, but as a place that had chosen to change, quietly, completely, and without asking for permission from anything beyond its own walls.